February 11, 2026, 4:47 a.m. A fuel storage terminal on Russia's Baltic coast sits in frozen silence. 16 massive cylindrical tanks, each holding tens of thousands of tons of crude oil, gleam under floodlights. Pipeline junctions snake between them, feeding product to a loading dock where Shadow Fleet tankers have been filling their hulls for months, dodging Western sanctions and funneling billions into Moscow's war machine. The facility's security detail is minimal. The nearest S-400 battery sits 90 kilometers to the south. Radar coverage from Kaliningrad extends hundreds of kilometers, but it's oriented westward, toward NATO. Not toward the southeast, not toward Ukraine, because Ukraine is over 2,000 kilometers away. No drone can fly that far. No weapon system Kiev possesses has that range. At least, that's what Russian energy officials believed when they went to sleep that night. By 5:22 a.m., 3 storage tanks would be burning. By 6 a.m., a pipeline junction would be ruptured. By noon, satellite imagery from 2 separate commercial providers would confirm what Russian state media refused to acknowledge. Ukraine had reached the Baltic, and nothing in Russia's energy network would ever feel safe again. I'm your host at WarfistTV, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're breaking down one of the most ambitious deep strike operations of the entire conflict. An operation that required months of engineering innovation, intelligence gathering, and operational security so tight that fewer than 40 people in the entire Ukrainian military knew it was happening. This isn't a story about a single drone strike. This is a story about how a country with no long-range bomber fleet, no cruise missile stockpile, and a defense budget a fraction of its enemies managed to hit a target that Russian air defense planners considered physically impossible to reach. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand why Ukraine targeted this specific facility, you have to understand what Russia's Shadow Fleet actually does. Since early 2023, Moscow has assembled a network of aging oil tankers, many of them with expired insurance, questionable safety records, and flags of convenience from countries that look the other way. These vessels load Russian crude at terminals along the Baltic and Arctic coasts, then sail to buyers in India, China, Turkey, and elsewhere, selling oil above the Western price cap of $60 per barrel. The revenue bypasses sanctions entirely. Conservative estimates from European energy analysts put Shadow Fleet earnings at over $15 billion in 2025 alone. The terminal in question, which Ukrainian intelligence designated Target Sigma 9, was not the largest facility on the Baltic coast, but it was one of the most operationally significant. Why? Because it served as a rapid loading hub specifically optimized for the Shadow Fleet. Tankers could dock, fill, and depart within 18 hours. The facility's pipeline connections ran directly to a trunk line feeding crude from western Siberian fields. And critically, the terminal operated on a schedule that aligned with peak winter demand, when oil prices spike and every barrel Russia sells generates maximum revenue. Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, had been tracking Sigma 9's operations since autumn 2025. Satellite passes cataloged ship movements. Signal intelligence intercepted communications between terminal managers and fleet coordinators. By late November, analysts had built a complete operational picture. Which tanks held product, which pipeline junctions were critical choke points, and which hours of the day the facility was most vulnerable. The question was never whether to strike. The question was, how? Which method was most likely to succeed at over 2,000 kilometers? A. A modified cruise missile. B. A long-range autonomous drone. C. A sabotage operation? Drop your answer in the comments below. Ukraine's drone development ecosystem had been evolving at an extraordinary pace since the start of the full-scale invasion. In 2022, most Ukrainian drones were either Turkish-made TB2 Bayraktars or commercially modified quadcopters fitted with grenades. By early 2024, Ukrainian engineers were producing indigenous long-range strike drones capable of hitting targets 500 to 700 kilometers inside Russia. The Lyuty and Beaver series became the workhorses of deep strike operations, hitting oil refineries, military airfields, and ammunition depots across western Russia. But 2,000 kilometers was a different problem entirely. The physics of drone flight impose hard limits. A small turboprop engine burning standard aviation fuel can only carry a drone so far before the tank runs dry. Increasing fuel capacity means adding weight, which increases fuel consumption, which reduces range, a vicious cycle that engineers call the tyranny of the rocket equation, even though it applies to aircraft just as brutally. Most Ukrainian strike drones in late 2025 topped out around 1,200 to 1,500 kilometers. Reaching the Baltic required a fundamentally different approach. Ukrainian engineers at 3 separate development bureaus, 2 state-affiliated, 1 private, began working on solutions in parallel during the summer of 2025. What they developed was a combination of innovations, none revolutionary on their own, but together capable of extending effective strike range beyond 2,000 kilometers. First, optimized aerodynamics. The airframe chosen for the mission, designated internally as the Shedrik 7, featured a high aspect ratio wing with a span of nearly 4 meters, designed for maximum lift-to-drag ratio at cruise altitudes between 300 and 800 meters. Every gram of unnecessary structure was eliminated. The fuselage was essentially a flying fuel tank with a small warhead bay and navigation module attached. Second, engine efficiency. The power plant was a modified 25-horsepower 2-stroke engine, cheap, reliable, and tuned to operate at its most fuel-efficient RPM throughout the cruise phase. Ukrainian engineers replaced standard carburetors with electronic fuel injection systems sourced from motorcycle racing suppliers, achieving fuel consumption rates approximately 18% lower than stock configurations. Third, and this was the real breakthrough, relay navigation. Traditional long-range drones rely on GPS for guidance, supplemented by inertial navigation. But GPS signals can be jammed, and over 2,000 kilometers of hostile territory, the risk of losing navigation lock was significant. The Shedrik 7 used a system Ukrainian engineers called breadcrumb relay. At predetermined waypoints, the drone would briefly transmit a compressed data burst to a satellite uplink, receive a corrected navigation fix, and adjust course. The transmission lasted less than 400 milliseconds, too brief for Russian electronic warfare systems to localize. Between waypoints, the drone navigated using a combination of inertial measurement, terrain contour matching, and preloaded satellite imagery correlated with onboard optical sensors. The warhead was deliberately small. Each Shedrik 7 carried approximately 15 kilograms of high explosive with an incendiary sleeve, enough to rupture a tank wall or sever a pipeline junction, but not enough to flatten a building. The goal was ignition, not demolition. Crude oil does the rest. Stay with me, because what happens in the next phase of this operation represents a masterclass in planning that most NATO militaries would study for years. By late January 2026, 3 Shedrik 7 airframes had been tested, validated, and armed. Flight trials over friendly territory confirmed the relay navigation system worked. Endurance tests verified that each drone could sustain flight for over 22 hours at cruise speed, more than enough to cover the distance to target Sigma 9 with a margin for course corrections and weather deviations. The launch site was selected in northern Ukraine, positioned to give the drones the shortest possible overland route through Russian-controlled territory. The flight path was not a straight line. Far from it. Ukrainian intelligence had mapped Russian radar coverage across Belarus, Western Russia, and the Baltic states' border regions in exhaustive detail. The Shedrik 7S would fly a serpentine route, exploiting gaps between radar fans, following river valleys, and forested terrain to minimize radar cross-section. The total flight distance was approximately 2,400 kilometers, nearly 20% longer than a straight-line path, but routed through corridors where the probability of detection was lowest. The operation was scheduled for a moonless night, with forecast cloud cover between 200 and 500 meters across most of the route. Low clouds would mask the drones visually. The overcast sky would reduce the effectiveness of any infrared search and track systems. On February 10, 2026, at 9:15 p.m. local time, the first Shedrik 7 launched from a concealed site in a wooded area. The launch method was simple, a pneumatic rail that accelerated the drone to flight speed in under 3 seconds. No rocket booster, no heat signature, no sound louder than a lawnmower engine starting at distance. The second drone launched 4 minutes later, the third 6 minutes after that. The staggered launch ensured the drones wouldn't fly in formation. 3 radar returns clustered together are far easier to detect than 3 individual contacts spread across several kilometers. And then silence. The operators could do nothing but wait. The flight across Belarus was the most dangerous phase. Russian and Belarusian integrated air defense networks overlap in this region, with early warning radars positioned to detect NATO aircraft approaching from Poland. But these systems are optimized for medium and high altitude targets, fighter aircraft, cruise missiles flying at 5,000 meters or above. The Shedrik 7 was flying at 250 to 400 meters above ground level, a tiny radar cross-section lost in the ground clutter that plagues every radar system on Earth. Ukrainian intelligence had identified specific windows in Belarusian radar rotation schedules. Certain mobile radar units were known to power down for maintenance during predictable intervals. The drone's waypoints were timed to pass through these coverage gaps. It was the kind of intelligence work that doesn't make headlines, but wins wars. By 1:30 a.m. on February 11th, all three drones had cleared Belarusian airspace and entered Russian territory proper. They were now flying northwest, paralleling the Russian-Latvian border at a distance of roughly 40 kilometers, close enough to benefit from the electronic noise generated by NATO surveillance systems operating along the border, far enough to avoid triggering Russian border defense alerts. At 3:48 a.m., the first drone executed its final waypoint correction. Navigation was nominal. Fuel reserves were within predicted parameters. The warhead arming sequence initiated automatically at a predetermined distance from the target, 50 kilometers out. From this point, the drone was a weapon. At 4:47 a.m., Shedrik 7 No. 1 descended from its cruise altitude of 350 meters to an attack altitude of 80 meters. It was now flying at approximately 160 kilometers per hour, a slow, steady approach designed to minimize engine noise. The terminal's floodlights were visible on the drone's optical sensor from 12 kilometers away. How many storage tanks did the Shedrik 7 drones ultimately set ablaze? A2, B3, C5. The answer comes at the end. The first drone struck at 4:51 a.m. Its target was storage tank number 7, a 30,000 cubic meter tank that satellite imagery from the previous week showed was at approximately 80% capacity. The Shedrik 7 approached from the east, flying below the tree line of a nearby forest, then pulled up at the last moment to clear the tank's containment berm. The 15-kilogram warhead detonated against the upper shell of the tank, just above the liquid level. The physics of what happened next are important. Crude oil itself is not particularly easy to ignite. It's not gasoline. But the airspace above the oil inside a tank, known as the ullage space, fills with volatile hydrocarbon vapors. When the warhead's incendiary sleeve ignited those vapors, the resulting deflagration blew the tank's floating roof off its guides. Within seconds, the exposed oil surface was burning freely, fed by oxygen now flooding in from above. The terminal's automated fire suppression system activated. Foam generators around Tank 7 began discharging, but crude oil fires at this scale overwhelmed fixed suppression systems designed for minor leaks. Within 4 minutes, the fire had intensified to the point where radiant heat was damaging adjacent piping. At 5:03 a.m., the second Shedrik 7 arrived. Its target was not another tank. Ukrainian planners had selected the primary pipeline manifold junction, the point where incoming crude from the trunk line was distributed to individual storage tanks. This was a harder target to hit, a collection of valves and pipes covering an area of roughly 30 by 15 meters, but the damage potential was enormous. Rupture the manifold, and crude oil would flow freely, feeding additional fires and making emergency response exponentially more difficult. The drone operator, though in truth this phase was fully autonomous, had preloaded the manifold's exact GPS coordinates, corrected by optical terminal guidance in the final seconds of flight. The Shedrik 7 dove at a 40-degree angle and struck the junction squarely. The detonation severed two 24-inch diameter transfer lines. Crude oil began fountaining from the ruptured pipes at a rate later estimated at 200 cubic meters per hour. The oil immediately caught fire from the already burning Tank 7 nearby. A river of flaming crude flowed along the containment channels, spreading the fire to the base of Tank 4. By 5:10 a.m., 2 tanks and the pipeline manifold were burning. The facility's control room had initiated emergency shutdown procedures, but the manifold rupture meant that oil was still flowing from the trunk line into the damaged pipes. Isolation valves upstream needed to be closed manually, and no one was willing to approach the manifold through a wall of fire. Subscribe to WarfistTV if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because operations like this one are rewriting the rules of conflict in real time. The third drone arrived at 5:22 a.m., a full 31 minutes after the first strike. This delay was deliberate. Ukrainian planners anticipated that emergency responders would be focused on Tanks 7 and 4 and the manifold area. The third drone's target was Tank 12, on the opposite side of the facility, a tank connected to the direct loading line feeding the dock where Shadow Fleet tankers berthed. Tank 12 was struck on its lower shell. The warhead penetrated the steel and detonated inside the liquid crude. The resulting explosion was less dramatic than the first strike. No fireball visible from distance, but structurally devastating. The tank's base seam ruptured, and tens of thousands of cubic meters of crude began draining into the containment berm. It ignited within minutes. 3 tanks burning, 1 pipeline manifold destroyed, emergency responders overwhelmed. Now comes the part Russian state media tried hardest to suppress. Satellite imagery captured by a commercial provider at 7:14 a.m. showed 3 distinct fire plumes rising from the terminal, visible from over 80 kilometers away. Thermal sensors measured surface temperatures exceeding 1,100 degrees Celsius at the center of the Tank 7 fire. A second satellite pass at 11:42 a.m., more than 6 hours later, showed the fires still burning, with Tank 4 now fully engulfed. By 7 p.m. on February 11th, over 14 hours after the first strike, fires at Tanks 7 and 4 were still not controlled. Tank 12's fire had been partially suppressed using industrial foam brought in from a facility 120 kilometers away, but the tank was a total loss. The manifold junction was destroyed beyond repair. Russian emergency services officially classified the incident as an industrial accident caused by equipment malfunction. No mention of drones. No mention of Ukraine. The regional governor's office released a statement about scheduled maintenance activities that had been complicated by weather conditions, but the evidence was impossible to hide completely. Local residents 15 kilometers from the terminal reported hearing detonations. Social media posts, quickly deleted but archived by OSINT investigators, showed the glow of fires on the horizon. And most damningly, the Russian Ministry of Defense quietly activated additional air defense assets in the region within 48 hours, redeploying a Panzer S-1 battery to the terminal's perimeter. You don't redeploy air defense systems to protect against equipment malfunctions. Ukrainian military intelligence confirmed the operation through carefully worded channels. No official statement named the target, but a GUR source, speaking to a respected Ukrainian media outlet, noted that Russia's ability to fund its war through sanctions evasion has been significantly disrupted this week. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. If you believe tactics win wars, type WarfistTV in the comments. Let's talk about the strategic impact, because a few burning tanks, dramatic as they are, don't change a war. What changes a war is the second and third order effects. First, Shadow Fleet disruption. The terminal was a key loading point for tankers operating in Russia's Baltic Shadow Fleet network. In the weeks following the strike, commercial shipping trackers noted a significant drop in tanker activity from the region. At least 4 vessels known to be associated with Shadow Fleet operations diverted to alternative loading facilities further north, adding days to their transit times and increasing operational costs. European energy analysts estimated the disruption cost Russia between $200 and $350 million in delayed or lost revenue during peak winter demand, the exact period when every barrel commands premium prices. Second, insurance and operational risk. The Shadow Fleet already operated on razor-thin margins of legitimacy. Vessels carried minimal insurance. Crews were often drawn from countries with limited maritime regulatory oversight. The demonstration that Ukrainian drones could reach Baltic facilities added a new risk factor that even the most willing Shadow Fleet operators couldn't ignore. At least 2 shipping companies reportedly suspended operations for safety assessments in the immediate aftermath. The strike didn't destroy Russia's Shadow Fleet, but it introduced uncertainty into a system that depended on predictability. Third, and this was the effect that sent genuine shockwaves through Moscow's military planning establishment, the range demonstration. Before February 11th, Russian military planners operated under the assumption that Ukrainian strike drones could reach targets approximately 1,200 to 1,500 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. This defined a threat radius that, while large, still left most of Russia's critical infrastructure in a zone considered safe. The Baltic strike shattered that assumption overnight. If Ukraine could hit a target 2,000 kilometers away on the Baltic coast, then virtually every oil refinery, pipeline hub, military depot, and command center in European Russia was within reach. The geometry of the war changed in a single night. Russian military bloggers, often more candid than official sources, reacted with alarm. Several prominent commentators demanded immediate redeployment of air defense assets to protect energy infrastructure deep in Russia's rear areas. But Russia's air defense network was already stretched thin, covering the front line, protecting Moscow and St. Petersburg, guarding military installations, and attempting to intercept the nightly waves of Ukrainian drones hitting targets across western Russia. Every Panzer or Tor system redeployed to guard an oil terminal was one less system available for the front. This is the strategic dilemma Ukraine imposed with a single operation. 3 drones, perhaps $50,000 in total hardware cost, versus hundreds of millions in direct economic damage, billions in increased risk premiums, and an air defense redeployment challenge that has no good solution. What would NATO have done differently with this intelligence and these targets? Drop your tactical analysis in the comments. Now let's examine the tactical lessons, because this operation will be studied in war colleges for decades. Lesson 1. Range is not a fixed attribute of a weapon system. It is an engineering problem. Ukrainian developers extended their drone range by roughly 50% in under a year through airframe optimization, engine tuning, and innovative navigation solutions. None of these innovations required breakthrough technology. They required engineering discipline, operational testing, and the kind of iterative development cycle that Ukraine's decentralized drone industry excels at. Russia, with its centralized defense procurement bureaucracy, cannot match this pace of adaptation. Lesson 2. Relay navigation changes the calculus of deep strikes. The breadcrumb relay system used by the Shedrik 7 solved the fundamental problem of long-range autonomous flight in a GPS-contested environment. By using brief encrypted satellite uplinks at predetermined waypoints, Ukrainian engineers created a guidance architecture that is extremely difficult to jam. Russian electronic warfare systems designed to blanket large areas with GPS interference are ineffective against a system that only needs GPS access for fractions of a second at unpredictable intervals. Lesson 3. Target selection matters more than warhead size. The Shedrik 7 carried only 15 kilograms of explosive, less than an artillery shell. But by selecting targets where a small ignition source could trigger catastrophic secondary effects, oil tanks filled with volatile vapors, pressurized pipeline junctions, Ukrainian planners achieved damage out of all proportion to the weapon's size. This is the principle of leverage applied to military targeting. Find the points where a small input creates a massive output. Lesson 4. Operational security is itself a weapon. Fewer than 40 people knew about Operation Sigma 9 before launch. The compartmentalization was extreme. Drone developers at different bureaus didn't know what the others were working on. The launch team didn't know the target until the final briefing. The intelligence analysts who identified the target didn't know which weapon system would be used. This level of secrecy meant Russian intelligence had no advance warning, no communications to intercept, no movements to track, no digital footprint to analyze. Lesson 5. Time on target coordination with autonomous systems. The staggered arrival of 3 drones, the first and second within 12 minutes of each other, the third arriving 31 minutes later, was a deliberate tactical choice. The first 2 drones created the initial damage and drew emergency response to the eastern side of the facility. The third drone struck the western side after responders had committed. This sequential targeting approach maximized total damage by exploiting the natural tendency of emergency teams to concentrate on the first point of crisis. Let me bring this into broader context. The Baltic terminal strike did not happen in isolation. It was part of an accelerating campaign by Ukraine to target Russia's energy export infrastructure. The economic engine that funds every tank, every missile, every soldier Moscow sends to the front. Since late 2025, Ukrainian drone strikes have hit refineries in Ryazan, Samara, and Nizhny Novgorod, pipeline compression stations in the Volga region, LNG processing facilities near the Arctic Circle. Each strike was individually significant. Together, they represent a systematic campaign to degrade Russia's ability to generate the revenue that sustains its war effort. The innovation driving this campaign is almost entirely Ukrainian. Western nations have provided crucial support, intelligence sharing, satellite imagery, diplomatic backing. But the drones themselves, the navigation systems, the targeting methodologies, these are products of Ukrainian engineering talent, funded by Ukrainian defense budgets, built in Ukrainian workshops. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. That is the single most important sentence in understanding this war. The drone operators who planned and executed Operation Sigma 9 remain anonymous. Their names are classified. Their faces have never been shown publicly. They work from concealed facilities, monitoring screens that show feeds from drones thousands of kilometers away. Each operator is worth a battalion, not in firepower, but in strategic impact. A team of 3 operators controlling 3 drones worth a combined $50,000 inflicted damage that a squadron of conventional bombers might struggle to match. Compare this to Russia's approach. Moscow has spent billions on its aerospace forces, maintained a fleet of strategic bombers, and invested heavily in cruise missile production. Yet, Ukrainian critical infrastructure continues to function. Ukrainian air defenses, bolstered by Western-supplied Patriot, NASAMS, and Iris-T systems, intercept the majority of Russian missile and drone attacks. Russia launches $100 million salvos of Kaliber and Kh-101 cruise missiles. Ukraine launches $50,000 drones. The cost-exchange ratio is staggering. And that brings us to the fundamental asymmetry that defines this war in early 2026. Russia has more resources, more territory, more population, more raw military hardware. But Ukraine has innovation speed, tactical creativity, and the motivation of a nation fighting for its survival. The Baltic terminal strike proved that these advantages can overcome sheer distance, literally over 2,000 kilometers of it. Russian military leadership now faces an impossible resource allocation problem. Protect every oil terminal, every refinery, every pipeline junction across a country spanning 11 time zones? The air defense systems don't exist in sufficient numbers. The radar coverage can't be extended far enough. The interceptors can't be everywhere at once. Ukraine has imposed a defensive burden on Russia that grows with every successful strike, forcing Moscow to spread its air defense assets thinner and thinner, while the front line demands more and more. Ukrainian General Staff reports released in the weeks following the operation noted a measurable decrease in Russian artillery ammunition deliveries to frontline units in the Zaporizhia and Donetsk sectors during late February. The correlation wasn't coincidental. When air defense batteries are redeployed to protect rear area infrastructure, frontline coverage suffers. When frontline coverage suffers, Ukrainian drones operate with greater freedom. When Ukrainian drones operate with greater freedom, Russian logistics convoys take heavier losses. Every decision Moscow makes to protect one area creates vulnerability in another. This is the cascading effect of strategic deep strikes. It is not about destroying a single target. It is about imposing choices on an adversary, choices where every option leads to a worse position. The intelligence work behind Operation Sigma 9 deserves special recognition. Months before the first drone launched, Ukrainian analysts were studying commercial satellite imagery, correlating tanker movements with terminal loading schedules, identifying the specific tanks most likely to be full on any given night, and mapping the fire suppression and emergency response capabilities of the facility. They knew which tanks held crude and which were empty. They knew the response time of the nearest fire brigade. They knew the location of every upstream isolation valve. This level of targeting intelligence doesn't come from a single source. It comes from the fusion of satellite imagery, signals intelligence, open-source shipping data, human intelligence from sources within Russia's energy sector, and analytical models built over months of patient collection. The GUR's targeting cell for energy infrastructure has become one of the most sophisticated analytical units in any military worldwide, a capability built from necessity, refined through experience, and validated by results. Let's talk about what comes next. Because the Baltic strike was not an endpoint. It was a proof of concept. Ukrainian drone developers are already working on the next generation of long-range platforms. The Shedrik 7 was effective, but it was also a first-generation solution with known limitations: limited warhead capacity, relatively slow cruise speed, and vulnerability to visual detection in daylight. Future variants are expected to incorporate improved stealth features, larger warhead options, and potentially swarm coordination capabilities that would allow multiple drones to attack a single facility simultaneously from different approach vectors. The relay navigation system pioneered for Operation Sigma 9 is being adapted for other drone types. Ukrainian ground forces have expressed interest in using similar technology for medium-range strike drones operating in the electronic warfare-dense environment of the front line, where Russian jamming regularly disrupts GPS-guided weapons. And the target list is growing. OSINT analysts monitoring Russian energy infrastructure have identified dozens of facilities, refineries, pumping stations, storage terminals, LNG plants that fall within the demonstrated range of Ukrainian deep strike drones. Each facility represents a potential target. Each potential target represents another air defense headache for Moscow. Real tactics, real consequences. WarfistTV. Now, the answer to our earlier question. How many storage tanks did the Shedrik 7 drones ultimately set ablaze? The answer is B, 3. Tank 7 was struck first at 4:51 a.m. and burned for over 14 hours. Tank 4 caught fire from the ruptured pipeline manifold and was fully engulfed by midday. Tank 12, struck by the third drone at 5:22 a.m., suffered a base seam rupture and burned until partially suppressed by industrial foam brought from 120 kilometers away. 3 tanks, 3 strikes, 3 direct hits from drones that flew over 2,400 kilometers through hostile airspace to reach their targets. Now, 3 questions for you. Was the decision to use only 3 drones the right call, or should Ukraine have committed more airframes to ensure total destruction of the facility? Could Russia have prevented this strike if it had allocated air defense resources differently? Or is the geographic scale of the threat simply impossible to defend against? What would you have done differently in targeting, timing, or tactics if you were planning this operation? Drop your analysis in the comments. The best tactical breakdowns get pinned. Subscribe to WarfistTV because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Baltic terminal is quiet now. The fires are out. Repair crews are welding new pipe sections where the manifold once stood. 2 of the 3 tanks are being dismantled, damaged beyond economical repair. A Panzer S-1 battery sits on the perimeter, its radar scanning the sky. But the operators know what the planners in Moscow know, what the engineers in Ukraine know, what everyone who studies this war now understands. Distance is no longer a shield. Innovation is the weapon, and modern warfare punishes complacency without mercy. Stay vigilant.